They were just kids, barely tall enough to ride roller coasters, still learning multiplication, some not even teenagers yet. But behind their innocent faces hid something far darker, something most adults couldn't even comprehend. In this video, we're diving into the most evil children ever sentenced to life in prison. That's right, ages 11 to 13. These aren't troubled teens acting out or making a mistake. These are kids who plotted, stalked, and killed. Some with chilling calm, others with terrifying rage. What drives a child to murder? What could push someone so young to commit acts so brutal, so final, that even hardened judges were left stunned? We'll take you inside the courtroom drama, the investigations, and the sentencing hearings that followed. You'll hear how prosecutors described children as calculating, how juries looked into the eyes of 12-year-olds and delivered life sentences, and how some of these killers showed no remorse, even when their lives were being handed over to the prison system. From Lionel Tate, who was only 12 when he was sentenced to life without parole, to Jordan Brown, who pulled the trigger at just 11 years old, these are the cases that shattered our understanding of childhood innocence. This is not fiction. These are real stories, real families, real lives destroyed by the hands of children barely old enough to read a textbook. This is the dark reality of the youngest killers ever jailed for life.
Next up for Tate, sentencing. That's the job of Judge Joel Lazarus. And Tate's grieving mother may now face civil charges, an option being discussed by the victim's parents and their attorney.
There is a law called culpable negligence on the part of the mother, or at least in this case on the part of the mother, in terms of maybe being negligent in her supervision of these two children, particularly in light of the fact that she knew that her son had some problems.
Lionel Tate. It was July 28, 1999, in Broward County, Florida, when 12-year-old Lionel Tate was left in the care of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, while his mother, a Florida Highway Patrol officer, was upstairs. What happened that night would mark one of the most controversial juvenile cases in American legal history. Hours later, Lionel called for his mother in a panic. Tiffany was lying motionless on the floor. Emergency services arrived, but it was already too late. Tiffany had suffered fatal injuries, ones the medical examiner later described as similar to a fall from a 3-story building. She had multiple fractures, internal injuries, and severe trauma. Lionel initially told investigators that he had been imitating professional wrestling moves he saw on television, throwing Tiffany into objects and jumping on her in what he claimed was just rough play. The case drew immediate attention not just because of Tiffany's young age, but because of Lionel's. At 12, he was still legally a child, but the state of Florida chose to try him as an adult under its felony murder statute. That law allowed a first-degree murder charge if someone dies during the commission of a felony, in this case, child abuse, even if there was no intent to kill. Lionel's attorneys argued he never meant to hurt Tiffany, that he was mimicking what he saw on television, not understanding the potential consequences. But prosecutors countered that the injuries were too severe, too sustained, and too brutal to be brushed off as childlike mimicry. In January 2001, Lionel was convicted of first-degree murder. At just 14 years old, he became the youngest person in U.S. history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision stunned many in the legal world. While the court upheld the verdict based on the law, there was growing unease about whether a child so young could fully understand the legal process or the consequences of his actions. His psychological maturity, comprehension of trial proceedings, and emotional development were all questioned after the fact. Critics pointed out that Lionel had never undergone a formal competency hearing before the trial began, a serious oversight in a case involving a minor. In 2004, that omission proved pivotal. An appeals court overturned Lionel's conviction, stating that without a proper mental evaluation, the trial had violated his constitutional rights. Rather than face another trial, Lionel accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder and was released with time served. He was placed on probation and required to undergo counseling. For a moment, it seemed like he might have a second chance. But that hope was short-lived. In 2005, Lionel was arrested again, this time for armed robbery. He had allegedly ordered a pizza and then robbed the delivery driver at gunpoint. The incident was a violation of his probation, and in 2006, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Lionel's case became a national symbol of the tension between punishment and rehabilitation in the juvenile justice system. Many wondered whether the harsh sentence at such a young age had done more harm than good. His attorneys argued that being incarcerated during formative years left Lionel without the tools to adjust to life outside prison. Some psychologists later suggested he had become institutionalized, unable to function in society after spending so much of his youth behind bars. His actions post-release raised uncomfortable questions about how well the system prepares young offenders for re-entry and whether early intervention could have changed the outcome. The case also ignited a larger debate about the treatment of juvenile offenders in the United States. Florida was one of the leading states in trying minors as adults, and Lionel's case helped fuel legislative efforts aimed at reform. Advocates pushed for laws requiring mental health assessments before juveniles could be transferred to adult court, as well as alternatives to life sentences for children. His name frequently appeared in law journals, court cases, and policy discussions as a cautionary tale of what happens when emotion, public pressure, and rigid statutes collide in the courtroom. Today, Lionel remains incarcerated, his early years overshadowed by a decision that continues to echo through the juvenile justice system. His story is complex, not just because of what he did, but because of what it revealed about how a nation handles its youngest and most vulnerable offenders. His case raised difficult but necessary questions about childhood, violence, accountability, and the role of the law in shaping futures. For many, it remains a tragic reminder that in the pursuit of justice, age and understanding must never be overlooked. Case 2, Jordan Brown.
Pennsylvania State Police have made an arrest. The suspect? Not some hardened criminal. It's an 11-year-old boy, Jordan Brown, accused of gunning down his pregnant, soon-to-be stepmom.
It was the frigid morning of February 20th, 2009, in Wampum, Pennsylvania, when 11-year-old Jordan Brown boarded his school bus, expecting another day at class like any other. Unbeknownst to him, when his father left for work that morning, something far darker unfolded inside their modest farmhouse. Kenzie Houck, Jordan's father's fiancée and a woman Jordan had called Mom, lay dead in bed, shot in the back of the head. She was 8 months pregnant, and both she and the unborn child had died. By dusk, police had charged her young stepson, a 5th grader, with murder. The reality that an 11-year-old might be responsible shattered the sense of safety in small-town life. Investigators were swift in bringing Jordan in for interviews, interrogating him twice that evening. They theorized that the youth model 20-gauge shotgun he knew about, once a birthday gift from his father, was the weapon used. They located a spent shell casing near the bus driveway and claimed Jordan had walked downstairs, retrieved a shell from his father's armoire, shot Kenzie while she slept, cleaned the weapon, and then caught the school bus. The only witness? His 7-year-old stepsister, who told police she heard a boom and saw Jordan with a gun shortly afterward. With no DNA or fingerprints linking him and no physical proof on the gun itself, the case relied overwhelmingly on circumstantial testimony and a single child's recollection. Jordan's defense later argued the stepsister, exhausted and only 7, may have offered inconsistent statements under pressure from investigators. Pennsylvania law automatically charged homicide as an adult crime, regardless of age. Jordan's case was initially set to be tried in adult court, meaning a possible life sentence with no parole. Public outcry followed. Major human rights groups decried the decision, calling for compassionate justice. A petition gained thousands of signatures, calling attention to the potential miscarriage of justice and constitutional violations inherent in trying an 11-year-old in adult court. Months later, the case transferred to juvenile court. In April 2012, Jordan was adjudicated delinquent, Pennsylvania's juvenile equivalent of a guilty verdict, for first-degree murder and criminal homicide of the unborn child. Yet even within juvenile court, doubt persisted. On appeal, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court unanimously vacated the adjudication in 2018. They ruled that the evidence was simply too weak. No reliable link between Jordan and the weapon, no clear motive, and no blood or forensic evidence tying him to the scene. The court acknowledged that the case might equally support the theory that someone else committed the crime after Jordan and his stepsister left. With no new trial planned, Jordan was finally released at age 20. Decades later, Jordan holds firmly to his innocence. He's now pursuing a federal civil rights lawsuit against the state troopers who arrested him, alleging that evidence was mishandled and that his stepsister's inconsistent testimony was improperly treated as fact. In late 2024, a jury in that civil suit ruled the troopers had not fabricated evidence, though the case remains in the public eye. Jordan says the criminal justice process stole 7 years of his childhood, from ages 11 to 18, time spent separated from family and life under institutional control. The tragedy did not only shatter one family, it raised profound questions about how the justice system treats children accused of the most serious crimes. Could a child as young as 11 truly comprehend intent? Was it fair to subject him to adult criminal procedures without safeguards? The case influenced legal discourse in Pennsylvania and nationwide, fueling calls for age-appropriate procedures, clearer standards for competence, and humane treatment when dealing with minors. Jordan Brown's story reveals heartbreak and uncertainty. A child spends his adolescence locked behind detention walls, facing charges with life-altering consequences, only to regain freedom years later without official exoneration. No trial testimony linked Jordan physically to the crime scene, yet his name became permanent in court filings. No motive was established beyond speculation about jealousy over the unborn child. And still, his life remained disrupted. School, friendships, emotional development, all overshadowed by suspicion. Ultimately, this became a cautionary tale about justice under pressure. It warned that a legal system must tread carefully when treating children under adult standards. It reminded communities that innocence must be fiercely protected, and that even one misstep under flawed investigation can redefine a child's entire future. For Jordan Brown, exoneration came too late to reclaim lost years. His steps toward restitution continue, but the questions his case raised about childhood, responsibility, and the limits of prosecuting youth still linger with force. Case 3. Nathaniel Abraham. It was October 29, 1997, when 11-year-old Nathaniel Abraham wandered into the courtyard of an Oakland County party store in Pontiac, Michigan. The cool autumn air masked what would become one of the most controversial murder cases in U.S. history. Nathaniel carried a .22 caliber rifle, told by some he had been firing into the night sky. But then, tragically, an 18-year-old man named Ronnie Green collapsed to the ground, fatally shot in the head. The boy who pulled the trigger was not a hardened criminal, but an elementary school student. From the start, law enforcement treated the case with uncommon severity. Nathaniel was swiftly charged under Michigan's Adult at Any Age statute that allowed the prosecution of minors as young as 11 in adult court. Investigators claimed he had stolen the rifle, practiced shooting at trees and streetlights, and then deliberately targeted Green. A spent casing was found near the scene, but the case against Nathaniel depended entirely on the interpretation of his intent. No fingerprints, no DNA, and no eyewitness confirming the shot. What unfolded in court would hinge on conflicting narratives. Defense attorney Jeffrey Feger, renowned for high-profile cases, argued that this shooting had been an accident. Nathaniel admitted to firing the weapon, but he insisted he never meant to hit anyone. Prosecutors maintained that Nathaniel had boasted about shooting someone and pointed fingers at a motive born of juvenile bravado. A marksman testified that hitting a target from the alleged distance was nearly impossible with that rifle. Meanwhile, psychologists noted Nathaniel had an IQ around 78, an emotional maturity similar to a 7-year-old. The gap between his stated actions and capacity to form intent became central in both testimony and legal theory. Despite his diminutive size and young age, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. When the sentence was handed down, it stunned many. Judge Eugene Moore ordered that Nathaniel serve time in a secure juvenile facility until age 21, a decision seen as surprisingly lenient given the option of 8 to 25 years. The judge described Michigan's juvenile justice law as misguided, built for punishment rather than helping troubled youth. Nathaniel would remain under strict supervision, with the opportunity for rehabilitation before potentially entering an adult prison. The judge's words implied that mercy, when paired with structure, offered a path forward for a boy who appeared lost rather than malicious. The case triggered widespread public debate. Civil rights groups, legal advocates, and mental health professionals criticized Michigan's law, arguing that prosecuting a child without adult reasoning as though he were an adult violated fundamental fairness. Nathaniel's family pleaded that the system had wrecked his childhood long before any crime occurred. They outlined how the system had repeatedly failed them, counseling referrals ignored, social services inaccessible, his mother working night shifts with no support for supervision. The murder case, they argued, was the final collapse of a system that had neglected rather than protected. Nathaniel's story did not end at 21. In 2008, he was arrested again, this time on a drug charge. His criminal record continued with multiple parole violations. In 2018, police cited an indecent exposure arrest. Through each setback, the narrative repeated: a boy thrust into adult consequences, struggling years later with psychological and social instability. As one expert noted, the trajectory of his life seemed to emerge not from a single bad choice, but from how institutional systems respond, or fail to respond, to childhood crisis. His case remains deeply unsettling. An 11-year-old stood trial for murder. A jury decided his fate based on a mix of expert opinions, witness accounts from tired children, and allegations of premeditation. In the absence of physical proof, the legal system navigated the blurred line between juvenile mischief and violent intent. Michigan's highest court, though it upheld the conviction, lamented the system's failure, defining Nathaniel as both guilty and victim of circumstance. Ultimately, Nathaniel lived the rest of his teen years behind bars. He lost the chance to attend high school, make friends, or simply grow. The system had an opportunity to divert him into therapy or education, but instead, it delivered confinement. His case became a national caution: how easily a child can be labeled most evil when accidents turn tragic and systems treat childhood as criminal history. In Michigan and beyond, the fallout led to intense scrutiny of juvenile waiver laws in nearly 50 states. Scholars called for mandatory competency hearings, age-appropriate interrogation protocols, and limits on prosecuting youth as adults. Nathaniel's case joined Lionel Tate's as a symbol of where the line must be carefully drawn and how easily it can be crossed. Today, Nathaniel Abraham is no longer in the juvenile facility, but he remains on probation and under supervision for past convictions. He reportedly works odd jobs and lives a life marked by what happened when he was still a child. The loss of innocence, the weight of a criminal record from age 11, it lingers. His path remains a reminder that behind every headline lies a person shaped by forces beyond their control. Though public opinion was divided, the prosecution demanding accountability, the defense demanding compassion, Nathaniel's story forces a reckoning. What is justice when the accused cannot be expected to understand adult consequences? When the system's aim is retribution rather than rehabilitation, victims and offenders alike may suffer lasting damage. And through it all, one of America's most controversial juvenile murder cases stands as the stark question: how far should law carry childhood into punishment? That question remains unsettled. Case 4, Jasmine Richardson. It was April 23, 2006, in Medicine Hat, Alberta, when 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson and her 23-year-old boyfriend Jeremy Steinke executed a plan that stunned an entire country. By sunrise, Jasmine's parents, Mark, 42, and Deborah, 48, and her 8-year-old brother Tyler had all been stabbed to death in their own home. Authorities initially believed Jasmine might have been kidnapped. Instead, she masterminded the attack. Investigators uncovered horrifying evidence. Deborah lay in the basement with 12 stab wounds. Mark was found nearby with more than 24. Even Tyler's throat had been slit. Once the massacre was revealed, police learned Jasmine had let Jeremy into the house through a basement window. An act that signaled chilling intent. Inside, debris of a family's collapse lay all around, while a child's drawing in Jasmine's school locker depicted her family being murdered. That drawing became a silent testament to premeditation. Online exchanges between Jasmine and Steinke revealed their escalating fantasies. Jasmine confided, "It begins with me killing them and ends with me living with you." Steinke, who adopted an online persona claiming to be a 300-year-old werewolf, encouraged the plot. Their twisted bond, forged on social media and gothic subculture, cut them off from empathy. Jasmine's posts on vampirefreaks.com boasted a fascination with serial killers and blood. She lied about her age, claimed to be 15, and left cryptic messages such as "Runaway Devil" and "Welcome to my tragic end." Captured one day later in Saskatchewan, the pair admitted guilt. In court, Jasmine insisted her messages were hypothetical. She only fantasized about violence. But the jury saw a 12-year-old who had recruited and facilitated murder. She was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder, the youngest person ever in Canada to face such charges. The legal maximum under the Youth Criminal Justice Act was 10 years. She received that. 4 years in psychiatric care followed by conditional supervision marked the end of her sentence in 2016. Her record was formally expunged in 2020. Steinke, meanwhile, pleaded guilt and was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 25 years. During the trial, prosecutors alleged Jasmine had stabbed Tyler herself, or at least helped hold him down. Witnesses testified. Steinke said he gutted them like fish, while Jasmine added, "My little brother gargled." After the murders, the couple reportedly attended a party, interacting normally, as though nothing had happened. The narrative around Jasmine's behavior fractured public perception. Was she a victim of grooming and manipulation, or a schemer untouched by remorse? Psychiatric assessments diagnosed conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. She underwent intensive rehabilitation. A judge later said she had met all her rehabilitation goals. Observers noted genuine remorse by her early 20s, though critics questioned whether true repentance could come from such a violent impetus. The court proceedings sparked debate across Canada. Under its Youth Criminal Justice Act, children under 14 cannot be sentenced as adults. That meant even for multiple murders, Jasmine's punishment remained capped, drawing both criticism and legal scrutiny. Advocates argued the law balanced accountability with developmental incapacity, while critics believed extreme cases demanded stricter punishment. The Richardson case forced reconsideration of how far youth justice should stretch. Beyond sensational headlines, this tragedy speaks to broader patterns. Unchecked online influence, the perils of grooming by older partners, the social isolation of early adolescence and rebellion. The intersections between teenage rebellion, goth culture fascination, and a predatory adult's influence demonstrate how emotional vulnerability can be weaponized. As Jasmine reintegrated into society, she vanished into relative anonymity. Friends reported she enrolled in university courses and has not reoffended. Her release ignited outrage among families of victims and safety advocates concerned about community risk and youth rehabilitation. This case defies simple answers. It challenges notions of innocence, punishment, and redemption. How does society respond when a child leads a deadly conspiracy? When the legal system's maximum sentence still fails to match the severity of the crime, questions arise. Can rehabilitation succeed under such frameworks? Or does it merely mask delayed justice? Jasmine Richardson's story remains one of the most disturbing teen killers, not just because of the carnage, but because it forces us to confront the fragile boundary between youth rebellion and lethal violence. Jasmine's narrative shows that evil can be orchestrated by the very young, and that the justice system tasked with handling it must balance public safety with the frailty of adolescence. Case 5. Paul Gingerich. On April 20, 2010, in the quiet Indiana town of Cromwell, 12-year-old Paul Gingerich sat in the living room of his friend Colt Lundy's home, waiting. Minutes later, with Colt standing beside him, the two boys raised their handguns and opened fire on Colt's stepfather, 49-year-old Philip Danner. The shot struck Danner multiple times, killing him almost instantly. The motive was as startling as the act itself. The boys wanted to run away to Arizona, and Danner stood in their way. With him gone, they believed they could start a new life. After the shooting, they packed a car with supplies, left a note behind, and set off, only to be caught by law enforcement in Illinois within a few hours. News of the murder rippled across Indiana and beyond. What made this case so deeply disturbing wasn't just the age of the boys, but the degree of planning involved. Police reports and court documents showed they had discussed the killing in advance. A third boy, who initially was part of the plan but backed out, testified that the shooting had been carefully thought out. Gingerich, at just 12 years old, was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Under Indiana law at the time, prosecutors were allowed to move cases involving juveniles as young as 10 to adult court if the crime was deemed serious enough. And in this case, they did. In adult court, Gingerich faced a sentence that could keep him behind bars for decades. His defense team fought to have the case sent back to juvenile court, citing his age, lack of criminal history, and vulnerability to peer pressure. But the court refused. At 13, Gingerich accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 25 years, 5 in a juvenile facility, and the remaining 20 in adult prison. He became one of the youngest children in the United States to be sentenced as an adult. Over time, the decision drew sharp criticism. Legal experts and child advocacy groups began to raise concerns about how the justice system handled very young offenders. Could a preteen truly understand the consequences of such a plea? Was there enough room for rehabilitation within such a severe sentence? These questions ignited legal reform efforts, leading to a new law in Indiana known as Paul's Law, that gave judges more flexibility in sentencing juveniles. In 2013, Gingerich's legal team filed a motion asking the court to reconsider his sentence. The appeals court agreed, ruling that the trial court had not fully considered whether adult sentencing was appropriate for a child so young. After years of legal battles, Gingerich's sentence was modified. He was transferred from prison to a juvenile facility and later allowed to complete the remainder of his sentence through a re-entry program and home detention. He was released in 2017 under strict conditions. While no longer incarcerated, he remained under state supervision and subject to regular check-ins, electronic monitoring, and travel restrictions. By then, Gingerich had changed. He had earned his high school diploma, completed behavior therapy, and participated in restorative justice programs. In court, he expressed remorse for the murder and said he no longer resembled the child who made such a fatal decision. The court acknowledged that while his crime had been horrific, he had shown a willingness to change and take responsibility. Philip Danner's family, however, still felt the loss acutely. To them, justice could never be fully served. No matter how much Paul reformed, the fact remained that a man had lost his life. And they questioned whether someone so young should ever be released after committing such a brutal act. The case sparked lasting conversations about juvenile justice, not just in Indiana but across the country. Should a child be treated like an adult because of the seriousness of a crime? What role does peer influence play when a minor becomes involved in violence? And how do courts weigh the need for punishment against the possibility for rehabilitation? Gingerich's case has since been studied by criminologists, lawmakers, and youth advocates. It has been cited in debates over mandatory minimums, the psychology of adolescent brain development, and the effectiveness of juvenile incarceration. Some argue it proves that kids can be rehabilitated. Others see it as a warning that serious crimes can't be softened simply because of age. Now in his 20s, Paul Gingerich continues to live under supervision, slowly re-entering society. His life will forever be marked by what happened that spring day in 2010. For many, he represents a complicated truth, that even the very young are capable of unimaginable violence, but they may also be capable of change. Case 6. Eric Smith. In the summer of 1993, in quiet Savona, New York, 13-year-old Eric Smith pedaled toward a local day camp. Just blocks from his home walked 4-year-old Derek Roby, smiling as he journeyed alone. At 13, Eric was still a child, but something inside him had darkened. Instead of passing by on the bike path, he lured Derek into the woods, a decision that would forever fracture innocence. Within minutes, the woods turned into a scene of unthinkable violence. Eric strangled Derek until consciousness slipped away, then struck him repeatedly with a rock. When Derek was motionless, Eric dropped a large stone on his head and poured Kool-Aid into his wounds. In forensic reports, the methodical cruelty sent shockwaves across the nation. A child had killed a child, and the relentlessness of that act struck fear into every parent, every neighbor, every victim's family. When Derek didn't return, a mother's heartbeat pounded with fear. Hours later, his body was discovered just feet from the park he had intended to reach, his lunch smashed beside him. Community grief turned to horror as investigators worked the case. A family acquaintance reported that Eric, earlier that day, asked what would happen if a child committed this crime, an unnerving sign of his internal turmoil. Soon, Eric confessed, "I'm sorry, Mom. I killed that little boy," he told relatives. Police quickly brought Eric in for interviews. He initially denied involvement, but later gave chilling detail about how he approached Derek, took a rock from the ground, and committed the act. Investigators replayed the scene with him, noting how he seemed almost detached, as though carrying out someone else's plan. Within a year, Eric was tried as an adult. The court heard expert testimony describing him as socially isolated, academically behind, and suffering from bullying. He was emotionally vulnerable and prone to explosive rage. Psychologists diagnosed him with intermittent explosive disorder, ADHD, and depression. Though his attorneys warned he lacked full impulse control, prosecutors insisted Eric understood the gravity of his acts. A jury agreed. Convicted of second-degree murder in August 1994, Eric received the maximum sentence currently allowed, 9 years to life. He became New York State's youngest person ever tried as an adult for murder. In the juvenile detention center, Eric spent his teenage years behind bars. He transitioned to adult prison at age 21. Every 2 years he returned before the parole board, but hopes for release were repeatedly denied. At his first hearing in 2002, officials cited a lack of remorse and ongoing risk to public safety. The Roby family, Doreen and Dale, attended many of these hearings. Each time they opposed release, their trauma rekindled with every new evaluation. In interviews over the decades, Eric offered insight into his motivations. He said being bullied, teased for his hair, glasses, and size, left him feeling powerless. He admitted he didn't feel remorse at first. "Instead of me being hurt, I was hurting somebody else." He described how the act had given him a sick sense of control. The psychological damage was deep, rooted in early life trauma, hatred, and rage. After 27 parole hearings, a breakthrough came in October 2021. Eric, now 41, appeared before the board for an 11th time. He spoke calmly of his future, living with his mother or fiancée, working in electrical installation or carpentry, and pursuing ministry. He read courtroom notes, shared letters from supporters, and described earning certifications in prison. He insisted he posed no threat and claimed transformation through therapy and years of remorse. Despite protests and memorial services in Savona, the parole board granted release effective February 1, 2022. Eric moved to Queens under lifetime parole. Community members staged peaceful vigils as bridges to the past remained burned. Derek's mother spoke poignantly. "I don't let him take space in my mind. I don't focus on him or what he's doing as long as he's not near my child." The case of Eric Smith remains one of the most unsettling in U.S. juvenile justice. A 13-year-old was held fully accountable as an adult offender. For nearly 3 decades, he carried the label of child killer. Yet even while incarcerated, he earned therapy certificates, expressed regret, and pledged a new path. During his final parole hearing, he acknowledged the person he was and the person he'd become. "That 13-year-old kid is not the man sitting before you," he told the board. "If you give me a chance, I will prove I'm not a threat." The question lingered. Can violence born of childhood pain ever be tempered into redemption? The justice system had to decide. Eric's release sparked debate. Some argued rehabilitation had succeeded, others believed lifelong consequences merit lifelong oversight. His case appears in law reviews and juvenile justice discussions, raising questions about how childhood trauma, peer victimization, and mental health intersect with violence. His journey forced policymakers to reassess parole timing, sentencing for juveniles, and support for young offenders behind bars. For the community of Savona, the wounds remain fresh. But for Eric, what lies ahead is unknown. He settled in Queens, far from the woods where Derek's life ended and his own began unraveling. His fiancée, a law student, and his community work are signs of a life redirected, though never forgotten. This story confronts something primal. The idea that a child can kill with intent, yet be guided back towards society. Juvenile star power met devastating violence. The court decided punishment, but time forced reconsideration. Behind every legal precedent is a boy who lost his life, and a boy who had lost himself. Eric Smith's life after parole remains under supervision, his past still public, his future uncertain. His case lingers as a reminder. When society punishes its youngest offenders, justice must weigh both cruelty and capacity for change. Case 7. Mitchell Johnson. On March 24, 1998, at Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas, 13-year-old Mitchell Johnson and 11-year-old Andrew Golden executed a chilling ambush. Johnson and Golden were not close friends. They rode the same school bus, but both displayed troubling behavior. Johnson was known to claim gang affiliations, express fascination with guns, and even say he had a lot of killing to do. Golden, his younger accomplice, was regarded as polite, but had previously fired a BB gun at classmates and threatened violence. When Golden triggered a fire alarm at midday, they struck. Mitchell opened fire with rifles and handguns from a wooded area adjacent to the evacuation path, hitting fleeing students and staff at point-blank range. 5 were killed, a teacher and 4 young girls, and 10 others were injured. In less than 10 minutes, the pair attempted escape but were apprehended before reaching their getaway van, stocked with camping gear and ammunition. While they were still just children, law enforcement treated the incident with the gravity of a full-scale massacre. Arkansas law stipulated that offenders under 14 could be confined only until age 21. But the prosecutor later admitted that, were they older, he would have sought the death penalty. Johnson and Golden were charged with capital murder and battery counts and transferred to the state's most secure juvenile facility. In August 1998, Mitchell, who had just turned 14, pled guilty during a brief hearing. Golden was found guilty the same day. Both received the maximum juvenile sentence, incarceration until their respective 21st birthdays. From behind bars, Johnson wrote a letter of remorse. "My thoughts and prayers are with those people who were killed. I am really sad inside." He later read another letter before the court, apologizing to the victims' families and claiming he didn't intend to target anyone personally. But many remembered he had threatened specific classmates, particularly girls who had rejected him. Those remarks took on a darker tone in hindsight. As Johnson and Golden approached release age, Johnson began facing new legal trouble. In 2007, he was arrested on federal weapons charges. By 2008, a judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison. Additional convictions for theft, drug possession, and identity fraud followed, including charges stemming from a stolen debit card used at a local restaurant. Within his sentencing hearings, judges expressed frustration. "You continue to run afoul of the law. I hope this is the last time," one told him. Over the next decade, combined state and federal sentences could have kept him incarcerated well into adulthood. Ultimately, Mitchell Johnson was released on his 21st birthday after nearly 7 years in custody. Andrew Golden followed 2 years later after completing 9 years. Their release came on schedule, despite public outcry from victim families and community members who believed justice had fallen short. A wrongful death lawsuit awarded survivors $150 million, though the shooter's youth limited what punishment the state could impose. Mitchell's path after release included legal setbacks. In 2008, he faced federal sentencing over weapons charges. Then came arrests for drug possession in 2007, theft and identity fraud, and a refusal to comply with probation conditions. A judge lamented that he had failed to use the opportunities given for rehabilitation. His total sentences ranged from 12 to 18 years, plus the 4-year federal term. Although many of these served concurrently, they extended his time in supervision well into his adulthood. The Westside Middle School shooting remains one of the most harrowing juvenile cases. Mitchell Johnson, just 13, unleashed lethal violence in a crowded schoolyard. His case laid bare gaps in the juvenile justice system, how children with violent intent were managed, how socioeconomic or emotional issues were handled, and whether incarceration until 21 was sufficient for such severe crimes. In subsequent years, the shooting prompted critical legal reform in Arkansas. The legislature passed laws granting prosecutors the discretion to charge serious juvenile offenders as adults, even those under 14. They also created separate facilities for 18 to 21-year-old youth. These changes were a direct response to the brutality of the Westside attack, an acknowledgement that some childhood acts transcend juvenile boundaries. Mitchell's attempts at redemption met resistance. His criminal record following release reinforced fears that the core issues, impulse control, peer influence, and entitlement, were never fully addressed. But to others, his relative quiet adulthood, combined with graduation from juvenile facilities, suggested possibilities for rehabilitation, even when early crimes were unforgivable. Today, people remember the 5 victims: Shannon Wright, Paige Herring, Natalie Brooks, Stephanie Johnson, and Brittany Varner. On the grounds of Westside Middle School and in a nearby memorial garden, the names are carved into stone, surrounded by 5 white trees and 5 picnic tables, a testament to lives lost. In the shadow of that memorial, Mitchell Johnson lives under parole and probation restrictions, often out of public view. The full arc of Mitchell Johnson's story, from the schoolyard massacre to legislative reform and his own troubled adulthood, forces a reckoning. How does a community recover when its youngest residents commit acts of mass violence? When punishment ends at 21, what safeguards enforce lasting change? And how, if ever, can a person sentenced for taking lives before their teenage years rebuild a life? Mitchell Johnson's case is one that continues to shape conversations on childhood homicide, school safety, juvenile law, and emotional development. His legacy is painful: a town in mourning, children lost, and 2 boys thrust into headlines they never fully understood. But it's also sobering: a story where age anchored no mercy, and societal reforms were built on tragedy. Case 8. Andrew Golden. On the morning of March 24, 1998, 11-year-old Andrew Douglas Golden and 13-year-old Mitchell Johnson carried out one of the most harrowing school shootings in U.S. history at Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Andrew had spent the evening helping Mitchell load his mother's van with supplies and a staggering arsenal of stolen firearms, 9 weapons ranging from rifles to revolvers, as their plan took shape under his grandfather's roof. He was raised around guns. By age 11, He was already known as a gun nar, a child who threatened classmates and showed alarming aggression. That morning, the two boys arrived late to school after intentionally missing the bus. At around 12:40 p.m., Andrew pulled the fire alarm during fifth period. As students and teachers evacuated, Mitchell and Andrew, hidden in nearby woods, opened fire on the crowd with high-caliber weapons, shooting at point-blank range. 5 were killed. Fourth-grade teacher Shannon Wright, 12-year-olds Stephanie Johnson and Paige Herring, and 11-year-olds Natalie Brooks and Brittany Varner. 10 more were injured before the boys fled into the woods and were arrested about 10 minutes later with the weapons and camping gear in tow. Law enforcement responded swiftly. Andrew and Mitchell were charged with 5 counts of capital murder and 10 counts of battery. Though they were under 14, Arkansas law at the time required them to remain in custody until the age of 21, the maximum juvenile sentence. Both were convicted and sentenced on August 11, 1998, with no possibility for adult sentencing due to age. Nevertheless, prosecutors later admitted that had they been older, a death sentence would have been sought. Post-sentencing, Andrew, who later legally changed his name to Drew Grant, was held in a youth facility and released on his 21st birthday in 2007. Mitchell was released in 2005. After release, Andrew died in a car accident in Arkansas in 2019 at age 33. Mitchell was arrested multiple times for drug theft and weapons offenses, underscoring concerns that rehabilitation may have failed. Families of the victims were later awarded a $150 million wrongful death settlement. Both boys had been raised in contexts that desensitized them to violence. Andrew grew up hunting with his family, given firearms as birthday gifts, and even reported torturing animals and making threats. Psychologist Peter Langman later analyzed the duo, comparing Andrew to Eric Harris of Columbine, the leader whose psychopathic traits influenced a more emotionally vulnerable follower. In this case, Mitchell. Andrew was described as mean, aggressive, and socially alienated behind a friendlier public persona. Interviews revealed he had threatened classmates, mocked teachers, and fueled talk of violence in school. The trial was rapid. Andrew's attorney argued that he was insane at the time and mentally incompetent, too young to face charges of capital murder. But the court rejected that claim. Within hours, Mitchell entered a guilty plea upon turning 14. Andrew was convicted shortly after. Both were remanded to Juvenile Justice Authority. Sentencing restrictions prevented longer incarceration, but prosecutors pressed hard for legislative changes. In the aftermath, Arkansas amended its laws, allowing younger juveniles to be charged as adults for capital murder and requiring separate facilities for offenders aged 18 to 21. That legal shift stemmed directly from the brutal efficiency of West Side, a daylight massacre carried out by children, yet with planning and force that transcended juvenile classification. Mitchell and Andrew's release stirred deep division. Parents and community members protested, still fearful that the young men would reoffend. Public memorials, including a garden and sundial engraved with 5 names, stood in tribute to those lost. Their records were sealed as juvenile offenders, but the impact of their actions remained public memory. In the years after release, Mitchell reoffended repeatedly, caught on firearms and drug charges, theft, identity fraud. Judges lamented he continued to run afoul of the law, expressing frustration that the opportunities for rehabilitation were not seized. Andrew's death in 2019 meant only Mitchell survived into adulthood, bearing infamy, becoming the last living mass school shooter in the U.S., not in prison. Today, the West Side shooting remains the deadliest middle school massacre in modern U.S. history, second only to Columbine in collective trauma. Andrew Golden's story, just 11 years old, raised with firearms, executing violence beyond childhood imagination, challenges how society handles juvenile offenders. He died far from the headlines he once made, leaving behind unanswered questions about prevention and justice. Mitchell Johnson's repeated offenses and parole violations raised further doubt. Does serving until age 21 offer the structure needed to interrupt cycles of violence? The tragedy forced critical conversations. How should juveniles with obvious predatory intent be treated? What warning signs, violent speech, social alienation, threats are missed before they erupt in violence? And what does a justice system owe victims when perpetrators walk free before 30? Andrew's life ended in a crash. Mitchell continues under probation and supervision, and only the victims' memorials speak of those whose lives were cut short. Their legacy is legal reform, hardened homes, and silent sorrow. Case 9, Curtis Jones. In 1999, 12-year-old Curtis Fairchild Jones and his 13-year-old sister, Catherine, walked into a Florida courtroom accused of murder. They had shot their father's girlfriend, Nicole Speets, inside their Port St. John home using a stolen pistol. Investigators later learned the siblings had planned not just one killing, but multiple, although they stopped after Nicole was dead. Her refusal to act on their claims of abuse fueled the plot's dark intensity, revealing a level of resolve that belied their ages. Law enforcement treated the case with utmost seriousness. Curtis became the youngest person in U.S. history to be tried as an adult for murder. The case went to court amid mounting controversy. Child abuse allegations surfaced, though never legally confirmed. Human rights advocates argued the children were themselves victims, pushed to desperation by neglect. Still, prosecution proceeded under Florida's adult charge provisions. The siblings pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received 18-year prison terms. Curtis entered South Bay Correctional Facility, while Catherine was housed separately. Both were required to serve the entirety of their sentences, followed by lifelong parole. A key element of the case was how authorities weighed age versus agency. Curtis had no prior criminal history. Psychiatrists noted trauma, instability, and emotional disturbance. Yet prosecutors asserted that the twins' actions demonstrated planning and awareness. In court, Curtis reportedly accepted responsibility, recognizing that their pleas for help had gone unanswered and concluding only violence would draw attention. That decision haunted many who reviewed the legal testimony afterwards. Did fear push him to violence, or did darker impulses take over? Behind bars, Curtis found religion and purpose. He reportedly became a Christian minister leading religious services for other inmates, speaking about redemption, and advocating for juvenile justice reform. Catherine also transformed her life behind prison walls. Both siblings later used their platform to shed light on systemic failures. Curtis and Catherine spoke publicly about the trauma that shaped their childhoods, the isolation of juvenile incarceration, and how solitary confinement compounded their pain. His sister would describe prison conditions as inhumane. Solitary confinement was hell on earth, she later stated, emphasizing the psychological toll on children. Public debate about the Jones siblings' case was fierce. Victims' advocates insisted that abuse did not justify murder. Others argued the justice system had seized upon two vulnerable minors, using them to validate harsh juvenile charging policies. Curtis and Catherine's long incarceration, children branded as killers, helped fuel a national movement against mandatory adult sentencing for minors. An outpouring of support among mental health professionals and juvenile justice groups called for reform, citing this case along with others involving child offenders tried as adults. When Curtis was released on July 28, 2015, he returned as a deeply changed man. Catherine followed in August. Both remained on parole for life, required to meet with supervisors and abstain from any rule violations. Their release made headlines, not for celebration, but for unease. Can someone as young as 12 continue to present a danger decades later? Is complete rehabilitation possible after incarceration denied typical adolescent growth? Curtis began work as a minister, reaching others who had endured childhood trauma and confinement. Catherine has spoken to state officials about the impact of isolation on juvenile offenders. Sister and brother represent both crime and redemption, a narrative of violence born from neglect and self-harm transformed into advocacy for change. But the wounds remain. Nicole Speets' family expressed ongoing pain, explaining that no apology or remorse can right the harm done. The legal debate persists. Curtis and Catherine plead that they were failed by the system. Critics argue their youth didn't justify locking them away like adults. Curtis Jones's case remains a turning point in discussions around juvenile justice. Florida's courts are now required to consider mental and emotional maturity before charging minors as adults or applying long prison sentences. That policy shift owes much to high-profile cases like his, where age, trauma, and violence collided in a child's life. Today, Curtis and Catherine live quietly, under parole oversight, focused on rehabilitation and advocacy. His ministry work includes mentoring troubled youth and challenging protocols that isolate juvenile offenders. Catherine remains vocal about prison reform and the need for trauma-informed care in juvenile facilities. The story of Curtis Jones is neither simple nor settled. A 12-year-old became displaced by violence, driven by family turmoil into actions he couldn't reverse. The justice system treated him as an adult, denying him the chance to grow into adulthood with support and accountability rather than adult incarceration. This case asks hard questions. When a child commits a violent act, how should society hold him accountable without extinguishing his potential for change? When the law applies maximum sentence, regardless of age, who pays the price? Victim, offender, or neither? Curtis and Catherine's journey, childhood crime, adult punishment, eventual release, maps an arc of destruction and a fragile hope of redemption. Their narrative stands as a reminder. Systems can fail both children and communities, but transformed lives may also hold lessons for legal reform and healing. Their release did not erase tragedy. It reframed it. And for many, the scars of that case remain as warnings. Innocence shattered by despair, violence born from vulnerability, and a justice system that must tread carefully when youth and culpability intersect. If these stories made you think twice, if they gripped you, shocked you, or left you craving to know what lies beneath the surface, hit that subscribe button now and join the Mindframe True Crimes family. Every week, we dive deeper into the hidden corridors of the human mind, unraveling the truths behind the headlines and the secrets even courtrooms can't fully reveal. And to all my loyal subscribers and returning viewers, thank you for keeping your mind in the frame. You're the reason we can keep shining a light into the world's darkest corners. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the mind is the most dangerous place of all. This is Mindframe True Crimes. Until next time.